You remember that weird mating scene in Fella Day that was super awkward and made you feel uncomfortable? This is basically that, the movie. Only with a lot more drugs, a lot more violence, and a whole lot more animal nudity. And despite having all that, this film is still only a PG. Nah, just kidding. This film is not only rated as mature, but was the first animated film in history to achieve an X rating. And my god does it earn it. This film has been requested to me for a long while, but I was always hesitant to review it, because I'm certain that just by even talking about some of the nature of this film, YouTube is very likely to have it demonetized, or at least have it run very limited ads. And I didn't want to do a review where I'd tiptoe around the themes of this film, because what's the point of that? But fortunately, I do have a sponsor for this video, so if this video does get demonetized, it's not going to be a total loss. So we're just going to have a quick shout out to them, and then get into the meat of this review. Have you ever had this happen to you in the street?
Can't you read? Can't you read, mister?
Well then, it sounds like you could benefit from Audible. Audible is the leading provider of spoken word entertainment and audiobooks. And yeah, you can still use the service even if you are literate. I personally found myself listening to the original Coraline book, which you can have narrated by Dawn French or the original author himself, which is pretty awesome. It was interesting to hear how different some of the book's elements are compared to the film, such as Coraline's personality, the absence of Wyborn, and of course, how it ends. During these challenging times of isolation, Audible has launched their new service, stories.audible.com, where anyone, anywhere, can stream hundreds of titles completely free, no strings attached. You don't even need to be an Audible member to access these stories completely free. If you would like to try Audible for yourself, go to audible.com/Steve Reviews, or text Steve Reviews to 500 500. You can start listening immediately with a 30-day free trial, plus one free audiobook of your choice, and unlimited Audible originals. Thank you so much for listening, guys. Now back to the review. Fritz the Cat was released in 1972. It was a different time for animation. Before the likes of shows such as South Park, Family Guy, Rick and Morty and BoJack Horseman appeared, animation at this point wasn't really seen as something that could be made exclusively for adults. Since the rise of television sets appearing in the households from the 1950s, animation started to become more and more geared to a younger audience, as not only was it seen as a great way to hold a child's attention to give mum and dad some peace, but more importantly, it was a great method to advertise toys to children.
Say, boys and girls, want a PF magic ring like mine?
Now, it's not to say there weren't any animated shows out there that could be enjoyed by adults, but they weren't really made exclusively for adults. That, however, was all about to change, thanks to a certain chap named Ralph Bakshi. Ralph Bakshi had been working in the animation industry since the 1950s, where he started out as a simple cell polisher, but gradually moved up the ladder to animator, and eventually director at Terrytoons. Despite being a director though, Bakshi was unhappy, as he didn't really feel like he had much creative influence, as in his own words, "We didn't really direct like you'd think. We were animation directors. Because the story department controlled the storyboards. We couldn't affect anything." So after a series of events, Bakshi ended up creating his own studio, Bakshi Productions, where he would now have the full creative freedom to make whatever he wanted. Bakshi believed that animation didn't always have to be geared towards kids and marketing, and so wanted to produce an animated film that could be made exclusively for adults. This is where he came across a certain comic strip created by Robert Crumb. The comic strip would follow the adventures of an anthropomorphic cat named Fritz, as he got into all sorts of raunchy and drugged up adventures. The strip was titled Fritz the Cat. and Bakshi absolutely loved it, and so arranged to meet up with Robert Crumb to discuss the possibility of turning it into a feature film. And my god, does this film have a crazy series of events during its productions, which led to multiple people leaving the project, Warner Brothers dropping their funding, and Robert Crumb himself wanting to distance away from Fritz the Cat for the rest of his life. It's absolutely insane. But we'll get into that stuff in a bit. For now, let's take a look at the film itself.
Justify my investment in you. But some of these people revel in the fact that their kids are...
So the plot of the film, if you can call it that, is set in New York during the 1960s, as we follow our main character of the film, Fritz, as he gets up to wacky adventures involving sex, drugs, and political activism. The reason I say plot in a very loose sense is that rather than feel like one solid story, it feels more like three separate stories that have been loosely strung together. And that's because it was. See, in part of the development hell this film was going through, the team weren't sure if this would actually get greenlit to be a feature-length film, so instead developed three separate plots that could be released individually. And these three plots are pretty easy to see, as they not only contain completely different settings, but also different characters too. The first plot involves Fritz inviting a group of girls to his friend's place in order to, as he puts it, seek the truth.
Oh yeah, now I'm getting to the truth, I think, yes. Oh yeah.
Which, because the other rooms are full, ends up just being a full-blown orgy happening in the bathroom. A couple of pig police officers turn up, because yep, of course they're pigs, where they beat up the people at the party and chase Fritz to a local synagogue, where it's revealed that one of the officers is Jewish. Yeah, a pig police officer who also happens to be Jewish. Just let that sink in for a second. Fritz eventually manages to get away, which concludes the first story. The second story involves Fritz meeting up with a black crow named Duke, which, yeah, if you thought the black crows in Disney were controversial, just wait till you see this film. And fun fact about this film is that the conversations happening in this bar are from actual conversations Bakshi recorded in New York.
Wiley was eating ham sandwiches and I was eating peanut butter sandwiches.
After a bit of a shake-up at the bar, Fritz and Duke steal a car and head to a place where, yep, you've guessed it, more sex and drugs take place. After some post-nut clarity, Fritz comes to the realization that he must tell the people about the revolution, and rallies up the black crows in the neighborhood to start a revolt against the system. This starts a riot against the police, which ends up getting Duke shot and killed, in what is actually a pretty intense scene. Fritz then quickly flees the scene as the violence escalates, to the point that the US Air Force turns up and starts bombing the area, and thus concludes the second story. The third story opens up with Fritz hiding away in an alleyway bin, whilst his girlfriend searches for him. And if you're wondering why I haven't mentioned his girlfriend before, that's because this is literally the first time she has shown up in the film. At first I was thinking she might be one of the girls from the first act, only a bit more grown up, but no, this is a completely separate character. And I wouldn't worry too much about her, as she is hardly in this film. We cut to the two driving out on the road, where the car runs out of petrol. Fritz heads off to get some petrol from the nearest service station, and that's the last we see of his girlfriend. I don't really know why she's included in the film, other than it being pure filler, as she plays absolutely no influence on the plot whatsoever. At the service station, Fritz meets with Blue, who, I kid you not, is described as a methamphetamine addicted Nazi rabbit biker. Yep, only in Fritz the Cat's, folks. Fritz heads along with Blue and his girlfriend to a hideout, which contains a bunch of revolutionists who want to blow up a power plant. Things soon get incredibly dark, however, where Blue's girlfriend begins to worry about the plans and so Blue just begins to savagely beat her with a chain, in which the other members then just join in to gang rape her. Yeah, like I said, pretty fucked up stuff. As the mission goes ahead, Fritz begins to have doubts about the group's motivations in the revolution, and so decides that he's not going to go through with it. But unfortunately for Fritz, it's too late.
Far out.
And thus ends the third and final story of the film. Well, not quite. We cut back to the hospital where Fritz is seen to have somehow survived the explosion. Yeah, one bullet through the chest, dead. Being at the heart of a ginormous power plant explosion, a few bandages. Blue's girlfriend is there by his bedside, along with the 3 girls from the first story. Even though they didn't really have much to do with Fritz, I mean, not even his girlfriend has turned up, but whatever. Fritz lies there on his deathbed, where it looks like he's about to have one final moment of clarity, maybe reflecting on his life and regretting some of the poor decisions he's made. But then he suddenly becomes revitalized and has an orgy with the 3 girls on the hospital bed. And that's the end of the film. I absolutely kid you not. Man, what a hell of a film this is. But if you think the film was crazy, wait until you hear about the production hell it went through. First up, a lot of people working on this film had major issues with it, which led to many of them walking out during production. Animators in particular. One woman quit because she didn't want to draw exposed breasts, and another guy quit because he didn't want to draw a black crow shooting a pig cop. But you know what? The film still went ahead and did it anyway. Some animators had to be fired because it turns out they weren't really animators, but rather just people who wanted to draw dirty things for a laugh. So you kinda had this weird balance where you not only needed people who were willing to draw this stuff, but also had to be good at it. As a result, the film was produced entirely without the use of pencil tests, with Bakshi having to judge the timing of the animation simply by flipping through the drawings in his hand. And of course, it wasn't just people working on the film having issue, but also the people funding it. Originally the film was to be produced by Warner Brothers, but they were unhappy with how vulgar some of the scenes were.
Guys, that's uncool. Don't do that.
So they asked Bakshi to just tone it down a little. Bakshi, of course, refused, and so Warner Brothers pulled out. And so the film ended up being distributed by Cinemation Industries, who were much more lenient and allowed Bakshi to have his full creative freedom. But of course, the biggest controversy to this film came from the original comic strip artist himself, Robert Crumb. Robert Crumb ended up hating this film, and I'm not using that term lightly. After the film was released, he did everything he could to distance himself from the product, even attempting to sue the studio if they didn't remove his name from the credits, which it looked like they didn't bother doing anyway. Crumb said that he didn't like the way the film portrayed leftists, especially in the third act, as Crumb was politically left-leaning himself, and felt that the film painted their cause in a bad light.
You're full of shit. All you care about is a reason to hurt, to destroy, to blow up.
He didn't like how the sexual nature was handled in some scenes. He thought it got a bit too dark and violent in the second half of the film. Hell, he didn't even like the voice that was given to Fritz. He really didn't like much of it at all. So how did they get him to sign the contract to greenlight the film in the first place? Well, they didn't. Yeah, Crumb actually refused to sign off on the film, so Bakshi got Crumb's wife to sign the contract in his name through power of attorney.
You signed my name?
So as a final act of spite, Crumb even had Fritz killed off in a future comic strip where an ex-girlfriend would murder him with an ice pick. But you know what? Despite all the production hell and objections this film went through, it actually proved to be a huge hit. On a budget of around $700,000, it pulled in over $90 million in box office revenue, showing the world that there was still a strong market for adult audiences, and perhaps also showing that Disney wasn't exactly kingpin of the animation industry, and that it was possible for other studios to compete to a more mature audience. So with all that having been said, what are my thoughts on Fritz the Cat? Well, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, once you take out the novelty of the sex and drugs, it really isn't that great of a film. Hold on. Like I mentioned earlier, the plot is all over the place, as we effectively have 3 separate stories that have been very loosely stitched together. And because of this, characters are weak with no real personalities or character arcs. Most are just there for boobs or as a piece of satire. The only character that I felt was getting close to an arc was the Black Crow named Duke, but then he's killed off quite soon and is never mentioned again. Even the main character Fritz himself doesn't really have anything going for him. He's basically just an arsehole that manipulates people around him. The film does attempt to give him a bit of a sympathetic trait in certain scenes, but then it's just completely undone by the end. I also mentioned earlier about how certain pieces of dialogue are taken straight from actual conversations that Bakshi recorded. Now that's pretty cool and interesting, once you know the context. But from face value, they stand out like a sore thumb. The audio quality is noticeably lower.
You're gonna get some results.
Right.
Really, because before all this rioting and shit, you didn't have no Head Start programs for kids.
And they don't really go anywhere, despite being on screen for several minutes at a time. It kinda just staggers the pacing a bit. As for the animation, well, it's interesting. It has a sketchy and quite amateur look to it, but honestly, I think that kind of works in the favour of the gritty nature and really fits in with the film's tone. Or should I say, it really frits in with the film's no. There are some really stylistic shots in this film, with some really abstract styles and colour palettes. One shot that stuck to me in mind is this random scene where a crow is just standing there snapping his fingers whilst the next scene appears. It's just visually interesting to watch, and also kind of reminds me of this scene from SpongeBob. Seeing this unique and quirky style of animation does make me wonder what Cool World could have been should Bakshi have been given his full creative freedom. It's quite funny to think that Bakshi as well didn't want to originally direct Fritz the Cat, as he wanted the film to have a more of a human focus rather than an animal one. Which is why in this film, despite the characters all being animals, they all behave as if they were humans, not even possessing animal-like traits such as being able to fly. It's kind of like in BoJack Horseman, where despite all the characters being various animals, they do behave very human-like. Only in BoJack Horseman, the animals still retain some of their unique animal characteristics. But yeah, as my final thoughts, do go and check out Fritz the Cat. It certainly is one of the more interesting viewing experiences I've had, and though I don't think there's too much there on surface level, once you begin to know the context behind certain creative choices, it really does become a whole lot more interesting, especially with the amount of political satire and commentary going on. I should probably quickly mention as well that I am aware there's a sequel called The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat that was produced in 1974, but it didn't have the involvement of Robert Crumb or Bakshi, and apparently it wasn't very good. So I'm not exactly in a rush to review it, but perhaps at some point in the future. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and until the next one, take care.